He looked at her across the altar, his eyes as dead as a winter morning. There was no romance here, no whispered promises of forever, just a signature on a contract that merged two crime families and bought her father's life. "This marriage is just business," Dominic told her later that night, uncorking a bottle of scotch he cared more about than his bride. But business goes bad, and their honeymoon was about to become a brutal fight for survival. A wedding in this world wasn't a celebration. It was a hostage exchange with better catering. Clara Gallagher stood in the vestibule of St. Patrick's, carrying 40 pounds of French lace and seed pearls that felt less like a dress and more like chainmail. Her father, Frank, stood beside her. He smelled of nervous sweat masked by expensive bay rum aftershave. He wouldn't look at her. That was the most telling detail of the morning. Frank Gallagher, a man who had cracked skulls on the Boston docks and built a smuggling empire with his bare hands, couldn't meet his 24-year-old daughter's eyes. "It's time, kid," Frank muttered, adjusting his cuffs. Clara didn't say a word. She took his arm. The organ music swelled, heavy and oppressive. The heavy wooden doors pulled back, revealing a sea of faces. 300 guests. Half of them were Gallagher men, the Irish syndicate of New England. The other half belonged to the Costello family. New York, ruthless, expanding. And at the end of the aisle stood Dominic Costello. He didn't fidget. He didn't smile. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit that draped perfectly over a boxer's frame, his hands loosely clasped in front of him. He looked like a man waiting for a delayed train, mildly irritated, but resigned to the inconvenience. Clara walked down the long, carpeted aisle, keeping her chin level. She felt the eyes of the Costello capos dissecting her, evaluating the new asset their boss had acquired. When Frank handed her over, Dominic didn't take her hand with warmth. He gripped her fingers the way one grips a pen to sign a check. Firm, necessary, forgettable. The priest spoke of love, honor, and sacred bonds. Dominic checked his Patek Philippe watch during the homily. It was a microscopic movement, a slight turn of the wrist, but Clara caught it. She felt a sharp prick of annoyance break through the numb resignation she'd carried for weeks. "He's bored," she thought. "My life is over, and he's bored." They said their vows. The words felt like ash in her mouth. Dominic's voice was a low, gravelly baritone, entirely devoid of inflection. When the priest told him he could kiss the bride, Dominic leaned in. He smelled of peppermint, tobacco, and an icy, unidentifiable cologne. His lips barely brushed hers. A ghost of contact. A camera flashed. The transaction was complete. The reception was held at the plaza. It was an extravagant display of wealth meant to project strength. Crystal chandeliers, towering centerpieces of white orchids, and a 10-tier cake that tasted like cardboard. Clara sat at the head table, sipping champagne that did nothing to warm her blood. Dominic sat beside her, but he might as well have been in another time zone. He spent the first 2 hours speaking quietly to his underboss, a towering man named Arthur, leaning in to hear whispers over the din of the jazz band. Finally, the obligatory dances were over. The cake was cut. Dominic stood and buttoned his jacket. "Walk with me," he said. It wasn't a request. Clara followed him through the crowded ballroom, out into a quiet, carpeted hallway lined with gilt mirrors. The sudden silence was jarring. Dominic didn't stop until they reached a small, private anteroom used for coat checks. He closed the door behind them, cutting off the muffled bass of the band. He leaned against a mahogany table and looked at her. Really looked at her, for the first time all day. His eyes were a flat slate gray. "Let's get a few things straight," Dominic said. His tone was conversational, businesslike. "I didn't want this any more than you did. Your father overplayed his hand in the port expansions. He owed me $3 million, and he couldn't pay. This marriage was the only way my captains would accept a ceasefire without putting a bullet in his head." Clara kept her face impassive. "I know the terms of the treaty, Dominic." "Good. Then you know this marriage is just business. Strictly optical," he said. Pulling a silver flask from his inner pocket, he took a short pull and capped it. "We are flying out tonight for the honeymoon, a week in Corsica. It's what is expected. The families need to see unity. The feds need to see a newlywed couple." "And when the doors are closed?" Clara asked, her voice steady despite the flutter in her chest. "When the doors are closed, you live your life. I live mine," Dominic said, flatly. "You'll have an allowance, a house in Westchester. You can redecorate, buy horses, whatever women in your position do to pass the time. But you will not interfere in my work. You will not ask questions. And you will not embarrass me." He stepped closer. The sheer physical presence of the man was suffocating. "I don't expect affection, Clara. I don't expect loyalty, not yet. But I demand obedience in public. Do we understand each other?" Clara looked up into those dead, gray eyes. She thought of her father, of her younger brother Tommy, who would have been killed in a turf war if she hadn't put on this dress. She swallowed the bile in her throat. "Perfectly," she said. "But let me make something clear to you, Dominic. I am a Gallagher. I am not one of your soldiers, and I am not a piece of furniture you bought for the living room. You want optics? Fine. I'll play the adoring wife for the cameras, but don't speak to me like a dog you're training." A flicker of something crossed Dominic's face. Surprise, maybe, or amusement. It was gone before she could catalog it. "Get your coat," he said, turning toward the door. "The car is waiting." The Gulfstream G650 tore through the night sky over the Atlantic. Inside the cabin, the silence was absolute, save for the low, steady hum of the jet engines. Clara sat in a plush leather seat, staring out the window at the black void. She had changed out of the wedding dress in the airport bathroom, swapping it for a cashmere sweater and dark slacks. She felt 1,000 pounds lighter, yet a different kind of weight had settled over her shoulders. The weight of permanence. Across the aisle, Dominic had a laptop open on a burled walnut table. He had been typing steadily for 4 hours. He hadn't offered her a drink, hadn't asked if she was tired. He simply worked. Clara watched his reflection in the dark glass of the window. His jaw was clenched. He typed with aggressive precision. He was a man who lived entirely inside his own head, a fortress of logistics, threats, and calculations. She wondered if he ever relaxed. She wondered if he even knew how. "Staring gives you wrinkles," Dominic said, not looking up from the screen. Clara blinked, caught off guard. She turned to face him. "I was just wondering how long it takes you to review a ledger. You've been on the same spreadsheet for 20 minutes. Dominic's fingers stopped. He finally looked at her, closing the laptop with a soft click. "I wasn't looking at a ledger. I was looking at security manifests for the estate." "Anticipating uninvited guests on our honeymoon?" Clara asked, letting a drop of sarcasm bleed into her tone. "I have enemies, Clara. So did your father. Now, by extension, we share them, Dominic said, rubbing the bridge of his nose. He looked suddenly tired. The stark overhead lights cast deep shadows under his eyes. The property in Corsica is isolated. It's safe, but I don't leave things to chance. He reached for a crystal decanter on the side table and poured 2 fingers of amber liquid. He held it out to her. Clara hesitated, then took the glass. Their fingers brushed. His skin was warm, a sharp contrast to his cold demeanor. To survival, Dominic said, raising his own glass. To business, Clara countered, tapping her glass against his. The clink of crystal sounded loud in the quiet cabin. The whiskey burned down her throat, settling in her stomach with a heavy, spreading warmth. They landed at Ajaccio Napoleon Bonaparte Airport just as the sun began to bleed over the jagged peaks of the island. A black Mercedes G-Wagon was waiting on the tarmac, the engine idling. The driver, a thick-necked local with a scar cutting through his eyebrow, took their bags without a word. The drive took 2 hours, winding up steep, treacherous mountain roads. The scenery was stunningly brutal. Sheer cliff drops plunged into the frothing azure Mediterranean below. Scrub brush and twisted pine trees clung to the rocky soil, shaped by relentless winds. It was beautiful, Clara thought, and it was a prison. The estate sat on a promontory overlooking a secluded cove. It wasn't a modern glass and steel mansion, but a centuries-old stone fortress. High walls surrounded the property, topped with discreetly placed cameras. Iron gates parted slowly as the G-Wagon approached. Inside, the grounds were manicured but austere. The house itself was massive, built of rough-hewn granite. "It's rustic," Clara noted as the car came to a halt on the gravel driveway. "It belonged to a local syndicate boss in the 70s. I bought it a few years ago. Gutted the inside, reinforced the perimeter," Dominic explained, stepping out of the vehicle. "It's off the main roads. Nobody comes up here unless they're invited." Clara stepped out into the crisp, salty morning air. The wind whipped her hair across her face. She looked back at the single winding road they had just traveled. If something went wrong up here, there was no quick way down. A small staff of 2, a middle-aged housekeeper and her husband, greeted them at the door. They spoke rapid, accented French to Dominic, who replied fluently, his tone brisk. He dismissed them for the week. "They won't be staying?" Clara asked, as the couple climbed into a small Fiat and drove back down the mountain. "No," Dominic said, picking up her suitcase. "I don't like strangers in the house when I'm trying to sleep. There's food in the kitchen. We can fend for ourselves for a few days." He led her inside. The interior was surprisingly modern, stark and minimalist. Cold slate floors, white walls, dark leather furniture. Not a single photograph, no art on the walls. It looked like a high-end waiting room. He carried her bag up a wide stone staircase to the master suite on the 2nd floor. It was a massive room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the sea. In the center of the room sat a massive king-sized bed. Clara stopped in the doorway, staring at the bed. The reality of her situation suddenly crashing down on her. Dominic noticed her hesitation. He set the bag down at the foot of the bed and turned to her. "I meant what I said in New York, Clara," he said, his voice softer than she had heard it before, though still devoid of warmth. "I don't take things that aren't freely given. The bed is big enough for 2 people who want nothing to do with each other. If you prefer, there are guest rooms down the hall, but the security detail requires us to maintain a certain proximity." "I'm not a child, Dominic," I can share a mattress without hyperventilating, Clara said, stepping into the room. She was determined not to show weakness. She walked past him, opening her suitcase and pulling out a toiletries bag. Which side do you prefer? The side closest to the door, he said, instantly. Of course. The tactical position. Clara nodded, walking into the adjoining master bathroom. She shut the door, locked it, and leaned her forehead against the cool wood. She closed her eyes and let out a long, shaky breath. 7 days. She just had to survive 7 days of this suffocating silence. The first night was a masterclass in uncomfortable proximity. Dinner was a silent affair. Clara made pasta from the supplies left in the pantry. Dominic ate it while reading a dossier on his phone. They washed the dishes together in a choreographed dance of avoidance, never bumping shoulders, never meeting eyes. By midnight, the heavy stone walls of the villa had absorbed the heat of the day, leaving the bedroom cool and still. Clara lay on the right side of the massive bed, staring at the ceiling. She wore a modest silk pajama set, hyper-aware of the space between her and the man lying on the left. Dominic lay perfectly flat on his back. He wasn't asleep. His breathing was too shallow, too controlled. He radiated a tense, coiled energy, like a predator feigning rest. The silence of the mountain was absolute. No traffic, no sirens, just the faint, rhythmic hushing of the ocean against the rocks 100 feet below. Then the cricket stopped. It wasn't a sudden cessation, but a gradual fading out, as if a wave of unease had washed over the hillside. Clara didn't notice it at first, her mind busy cataloging her regrets. But Dominic did. In the dark, she heard the rustle of sheets. Dominic sat up. "What's wrong?" Clara whispered, the darkness making her voice sound small. "Quiet," he breathed. He slipped out of bed, moving with terrifying silence. He didn't turn on a light. Clara watched his silhouette glide to the floor-to-ceiling windows. He pressed himself against the stone frame, peering out into the pitch-black grounds. Clara sat up, pulling the duvet to her chest. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs. "Dominic?" She tried again. "Get on the floor," he ordered. The conversational, businesslike tone was gone. This voice was pure steel. "Now!" Clara didn't argue. She threw the covers aside and slid off the mattress, pressing her back against the thick mahogany bed frame. The cold slate floor bit through her silk pants. She saw Dominic reach beneath the nightstand. There was a dull, metallic snick. In the faint moonlight filtering through the glass, she saw the blocky outline of a suppressed pistol in his hand. "What is happening?" she asked, panic finally lacing her words. "The motion sensors at the south wall went offline 30 seconds ago," Dominic said, his eyes scanning the darkness outside. "The backup generator didn't kick in. Someone cut the hard line. Maybe it's a storm? An animal? Animals don't cut fiber optic cables, Clara." Before she could process the reality of his words, the world exploded. The heavy glass of the bedroom windows shattered inward, not from a rock, but from the concussive force of high-velocity rounds. The glass didn't tinkle, it roared, a violent cascade of crystalline shrapnel raining down on the carpet. Claire screamed, throwing her hands over her head as plaster exploded from the wall above her. The sound was deafening, a relentless staccato popping, suppressed weapons. Professional. Dominic didn't flinch. He dropped to a crouch, raising his pistol, and fired twice into the dark. A muffled shout echoed from the lawn below. "They have thermal!" Dominic yelled over the chaos. "They know we're in here! Move!" He lunged across the room, grabbing Clara by the bicep. His grip was bruising, pulling her up with enough force to nearly dislocate her shoulder. "Stay low! Run for the bathroom!" he barked. More glass blew out. A bullet punched through the headboard exactly where Clara's head had been resting a minute prior. Wood splinters flew like shrapnel, slicing a hot, stinging line across her cheek. She didn't have time to feel it. Dominic shoved her forward, covering her body with his own as they scrambled across the floor. They tumbled into the master bathroom, and Dominic slammed the heavy oak door shut, kicking the deadbolt into place. It wouldn't stop a bullet, but it bought them seconds. The bathroom had no windows. It was pitch black. Clara was gasping for air, her back pressed against the cold porcelain of the bathtub. Her hands were shaking violently. The nightmare had found them. "Who are they?" she choked out. "Your enemies or mine?" "Doesn't matter," Dominic said. She could hear the mechanical clicks as he checked his magazine in the dark. He sounded entirely calm, which terrified her more than the gunfire. "They're here to kill us both. We're on an island, on a mountain. How did they find us?" "They didn't find us, Clara," Dominic said, his voice dropping an octave, cold and venomous. "They were waiting for us." He reached out in the dark, finding her face. His thumb brushed over her cheek, coming away wet with the blood from the splinter cut. "The itinerary was strictly need to know," Dominic whispered, his mind working the angles at lightning speed. "My inner circle, your father." Clara stopped breathing. No, my father wouldn't." "A $3 million debt vanishes if the creditor dies on his honeymoon," Dominic stated, a brutal, cynical truth dropping between them in the dark. "This wasn't a marriage, Clara. It was bait. You were the bait." Heavy boots pounded on the wooden stairs outside the bedroom. The door to the suite kicked open with a thunderous crash. Muffled voices, speaking Italian. Dominic grabbed her hand. It was the first time his grip felt less like a transaction and more like a tether. "There's a service corridor behind the shower wall," he whispered against her ear, his breath hot. "When I open it, you run down to the cellar. Do not stop. Do not look back. If you see anyone, you scream, and I will kill them." "What about you?" she asked, her voice trembling. Dominic racked the slide of his pistol. In the dark, she couldn't see his face, but she could feel the lethal, terrifying focus radiating from him. "I'm going to negotiate the divorce." Dominic's hands moved over the shower tiles with desperate precision. His fingers found a slight depression in the grout line, pressing hard. A hydraulic hiss cut through the noise of the splintering bedroom door, and a narrow section of the tiled wall popped outward, sliding back to reveal a pitch-black cavity. A rush of cold, damp air hit Clara's face, smelling of old earth and salt. "In," Dominic ordered, shoving her toward the gap. Clara stumbled into the dark. The floor beneath her bare feet was rough, unpolished concrete. She turned back just as Dominic pulled the heavy stone door shut, sealing himself inside the bathroom. The click of the internal lock engaging sounded agonizingly final. Then, total darkness. Above her, the world erupted. The muffled thud of the bathroom door being kicked. The sharp, rapid spit of suppressed gunfire answered immediately by the deafening, unsuppressed roar of Dominic's pistol. The vibrations traveled down the stone walls, rattling in Clara's teeth. Do not stop. Do not look back. His instructions echoed in her head, cutting through the rising tide of panic. She pressed her hand against the rough rock wall to her right and began to descend. The stairs were steep and narrow, designed for utility, not comfort. She slipped twice, scraping her knee against the jagged edge of a step, but the adrenaline masking her pain kept her moving. As she hurried deeper into the earth, the gunfire above grew muted, replaced by the heavy, ragged sound of her own breathing. Her mind, seeking anything to latch onto besides the terrifying dark, went to her father. A $3 million debt vanishes if the creditor dies on his honeymoon. Frank Gallagher, a man who had built his empire on loyalty and blood. Clara thought about the wedding morning, the smell of his bay rum aftershave, the way his eyes had stubbornly remained fixed on the collar of his shirt, refusing to look at her as he handed her over. He hadn't been grieving the loss of his daughter to a rival family. He had been looking at a dead woman walking. He sold her. He had dressed her in white lace, walked her down an aisle in front of 300 people, and handed her to Dominic Costello, knowing full well that an execution squad was waiting at the end of the trip. A wave of nausea washed over her, so violent she had to stop and grip the stone wall to keep from vomiting. Her father didn't just sacrifice her, he used her. She was the Trojan horse necessary to lower Dominic's guard. The grief lasted for exactly 3 seconds. Then the shock receded, leaving behind something cold, hard, and terrifyingly sharp. Rage. Clara reached the bottom of the stairwell. Her hand found a heavy iron latch. She pressed it down, and a thick wooden door swung open with a muted groan. She stepped into the cellar. It was a cavernous space, dimly lit by a series of small grated vents near the ceiling that let in the faint moonlight. Rows of towering oak wine casks lined the perimeter, and massive wooden racks holding thousands of dusty bottles created a labyrinth in the center. The air was thick with the scent of fermented grapes and ancient dust. Clara crept forward, keeping low. She needed an exit. Dominic had mentioned a way out, but in the sprawling darkness, she couldn't see anything resembling a door to the outside. A heavy thud from the far side of the cellar froze the blood in her veins. Someone was already down here. The hit squad hadn't just rushed the front stairs. They had secured the perimeter. They had covered the exits. A beam of bright white light swept across the floor, cutting through the darkness. It hit a wine cask 10 feet to her left, illuminating the swirling dust motes in the air. Clara dropped to her hands and knees, scrambling behind a massive rack of vintage Bordeaux. The cold slate floor bit into her palms. She held her breath, pressing her cheek against the dusty wood of the rack. Heavy tactical boots crunched on the stone floor. The man was moving methodically, checking the aisles. He muttered something in rapid, hushed Italian into a radio on his shoulder. A burst of static replied, followed by a harsh, guttural command. He was getting closer. The beam of his flashlight flickered through the gaps in the wine bottles, casting long, distorted shadows across Clara's face. She looked around desperately. She had no gun. She had no training. She was wearing silk pajamas. Her eyes landed on the bottom shelf of the rack, a heavy dark green magnum of champagne coated in decades of dust. Clara reached out, her hand trembling violently. She closed her fingers around the thick neck of the bottle. It was heavy, easily weighing 5 pounds. She pulled it slowly from the rack, praying the glass wouldn't scrape against the wood. The boot stopped at the end of her aisle. The flashlight beam swept down, hitting Clara's bare feet. The man grunted in surprise. He swung his weapon around, opening his mouth to shout a warning to his team. Clara didn't think. She didn't hesitate. Driven by a primal, desperate fury, she surged upward from the floor. She gripped the magnum with both hands, swinging it like a baseball bat with every ounce of strength in her body. The heavy glass connected with the side of the man's head with a sickening, wet crunch. The bottle didn't break. The man's skull absorbed the entire kinetic force of the blow. He let out a choked gasp, his eyes rolling back in his head, and collapsed instantly. His tactical rifle clattered loudly against the stone floor, the flashlight rolling away and casting a harsh glare against the far wall. Clara stood over him, her chest heaving, the heavy bottle still gripped in her white-knuckled hands. She stared at the prone figure, expecting him to leap back up. He didn't move. A dark pool of blood began to seep onto the slate, looking black in the dim light. Footsteps pounded on the hidden staircase behind her, heavy, fast. Clara spun around, raising the bloody bottle, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Dominic slammed the heavy oak door of the bathroom shut and kicked the deadbolt just as the bedroom door gave way. He didn't wait for the wood to splinter. He raised his suppressed Glock and fired 3 rounds straight through the center of the bathroom door at chest height. 2 muffled grunts told him he had connected. He stepped back, pressing himself into the narrow alcove beside the shower. He took a slow, measured breath, forcing his heart rate down. Panic was a luxury for the dying. He lived in the margins of violence. This was where he operated best. The bathroom door was kicked off its hinges. It crashed into the porcelain sink, shattering the mirror above it. A man in dark tactical gear poured into the room, sweeping the space with an assault rifle. Dominic stepped out from the alcove, moving with liquid speed. He grabbed the barrel of the rifle, shoving it toward the ceiling as the man pulled the trigger. A deafening burst of automatic fire chewed through the plaster above them. Dominic pivoted, driving the heel of his palm upward into the man's chin, snapping his head back, and followed it with a single shot to the throat. The man dropped, but he wasn't alone. A second shooter stepped into the doorway. Dominic dropped to a knee just as a 3-round burst tore through the space where his chest had been a millisecond before. One of the rounds caught him, a white-hot, agonizing tear across his left side, just above his hip. The impact spun him, but he used the momentum, bringing his weapon up and double-tapping the second shooter in the center of mass. The man crumpled backward into the ruined bedroom. Dominic stayed on the floor for 3 agonizing seconds, listening. Silence. The ringing in his ears began to subside, replaced by the steady patter of plaster dust falling onto the tile. He looked down at his side. His dark t-shirt was already slick with blood. The bullet had grazed his obliques, tearing through muscle but missing the bone and vital organs. It burned like a lit match pressed against his skin, but it wasn't fatal. Not yet. He stood up, ignoring the sharp spike of nausea. He checked his magazine. 6 rounds left. He slapped a fresh magazine into the grip and stepped over the bodies. His mind was a cold, calculating machine. 4 shooters dead. Standard hit squads run in teams of 6 to 8, 2 to 4 left, perimeter control. They would be securing the ground floor and the cellar exits. He moved through the house like a ghost. He didn't bother checking the guest rooms. He headed straight for the main staircase, hugging the wall. He found a 5th man standing guard by the front door, looking outward into the dark. Dominic put a bullet in the base of his skull from 20 feet away. The man dropped without a sound. That left the cellar. Clara. Dominic moved toward the kitchen, his boots silent on the slate floors. He found the main door to the cellar standing open. He descended the stairs, sweeping his weapon back and forth. The smell of dust and wine was thick. As he reached the bottom landing, he heard the sharp, unmistakable sound of a heavy impact, followed by the clatter of a dropped rifle. Dominic rounded the corner of a massive wine cask, bringing his gun up, ready to fire. He stopped. Clara stood in the middle of an aisle, bathed in the harsh beam of a dropped flashlight. She was wearing her silk pajamas, now speckled with dark droplets. In her hands, she gripped a massive vintage champagne bottle. At her feet lay a man in tactical gear, his head resting in a growing pool of blood. She looked up at Dominic. Her eyes were wide, feral, entirely devoid of the numb resignation she had carried down the aisle. She looked like a cornered animal that had just realized it possessed teeth. Dominic slowly lowered his weapon. He looked at the man on the floor, then back at his bride. "You didn't scream," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp in the quiet cellar. Clara's grip on the bottle loosened slightly. She looked down at the man she had just brained, her chest heaving. "I was busy." A faint, grim smile touched the corner of Dominic's mouth. It was the first genuine expression she had seen from him. He stepped past her, moving to the far wall behind the last row of casks. He pressed his hand against a seemingly solid patch of brickwork. With a harsh scrape, a heavy iron door swung inward, revealing a dark, rocky tunnel. "Smuggler's Tunnel," Dominic explained, his breathing growing slightly shallower as the pain in his side flared. "Leads down to the cove. The original owner used it to move narcotics in the 70s. He reached into a hidden cavity beside the door and pulled out a heavy black duffel bag. He tossed it onto his good shoulder with a wince he couldn't quite hide. Clara finally dropped the bottle. It rolled away into the dark. She noticed the dark stain spreading across Dominic's shirt, the way he favored his left leg. "You're hit," she said. "Grazed," Dominic corrected sharply. "It's cosmetic. We need to move. If there are more of them, they'll be sweeping the house now." He turned and walked into the tunnel. Clara looked back at the cellar, at the man bleeding out on the floor, at the life she had known evaporating into the dust. She didn't hesitate. She stepped into the damp, freezing tunnel and followed the Mafia boss into the dark. The tunnel smelled of rotting kelp and ancient brine. It was a steep, treacherous descent, the stones slick with condensation. Dominic led the way, relying on memory and a small penlight clamped between his teeth. Clara followed closely, the cold stone biting into her bare feet, her toes numb from the freezing mud. By the time they reached the end of the passage, Clara was shivering violently. Dominic pushed open a rusted iron grate, and the roar of the Mediterranean Sea hit them. They stepped out into a small, jagged cove, completely shielded from the estate above by an overhanging cliff face. The wind howled, whipping freezing ocean spray into their faces. Tethered to an iron ring driven into the rock was a black Zodiac inflatable boat, equipped with a heavy outboard motor. Dominic moved toward it, but his foot slipped on a patch of wet seaweed. He went down hard on one knee, a sharp hiss of pain escaping his clenched teeth. He stayed there for a second, his head bowed, his hand pressing desperately against his left side. The dark stain on his shirt was now a heavy, saturated mass. Get up, Clara said. It wasn't a request. She waded into the freezing calf-deep water, the cold shocking her system. She grabbed his arm, pulling him up with surprising strength. You die here, I die here, and I am not dying for your business, Dominic. Get in the boat. Dominic looked at her, his gray eyes cloudy with pain but sharp with amusement. He hauled himself over the rubber pontoon of the Zodiac, collapsing onto the hard plastic bench. Clara scrambled in after him. She grabbed the mooring line, fighting with the stiff, salt-encrusted knot until it gave way. She turned to the motor. She had spent her teenage summers at a lake house in New Hampshire, long before her father's operation moved from street-level rackets to high-stakes syndicates. She knew how to start an engine. She primed the bulb, set the choke, and grabbed the pull cord. She braced her foot against the transom and ripped the cord backward. The motor sputtered and died. Harder, Dominic breathed from the floor of the boat. Clara adjusted her grip. She thought of her father's face. She thought of the bullet tearing through her headboard. She pulled the cord with a vicious, screaming grunt. The outboard roared to life, a cloud of blue exhaust blowing over the water. Clara grabbed the tiller, slamming the motor into gear. The Zodiac surged forward, slicing through the black, choppy waves. She steered them out of the cove, keeping close to the jagged coastline, avoiding the open water where they would be visible to anyone searching with a spotlight from the cliffs above. They ran dark and fast for over an hour. The sky to the east began to bleed from bruised purple to a cold slate gray. Dawn was breaking. Miles down the coast, Dominic pointed a shaking hand toward a narrow inlet carved into the rocks. There, he shouted over the roar of the engine. Take us in. Clara navigated the treacherous rocks, cutting the engine as they glided onto a small, hidden crescent of black sand. Above them sat a dilapidated stone structure, an abandoned shepherd's hut, its thatched roof half caved in. They dragged the Zodiac out of the surf, hiding it beneath an overhang of scrub pines. Inside the hut, it was freezing, smelling of damp earth and old fires. But it had 4 walls, and it was hidden. Dominic dropped the heavy duffel bag onto the dirt floor and slid down the stone wall until he was sitting, his legs splayed out. His face was chalk white, covered in a sheen of cold sweat. Bag, he gasped, gesturing weakly. Clara unzipped the duffel. Inside were vacuum-sealed stacks of euros, 3 forged passports, boxes of ammunition, and a comprehensive trauma kit. She pulled out the medical kit. Take your shirt off. Dominic managed to pull the ruined fabric over his head, biting back a groan. The wound was ugly. The bullet had taken a deep, ragged gouge out of his side. It was bleeding sluggishly, but the flesh was torn and inflamed. I need to clean it and pack it, Clara said, her voice entirely flat. She felt detached, operating purely on survival instinct. I don't have anesthetic. Do it, he said, leaning his head back against the stone wall, closing his eyes. Clara tore open a bottle of iodine and a package of sterile gauze. She didn't hesitate. She poured the dark liquid directly into the open wound. Dominic's entire body went rigid. The cords of his neck stood out in stark relief. His jaw clamped so tight she thought his teeth might shatter. But he didn't make a sound. She packed the gauze tightly into the gouge, applying heavy pressure. Her hands, which had been shaking an hour ago, were remarkably steady. As she worked, the silence stretched between them, heavy and loaded. The adrenaline was leaving her system, leaving behind a cold, desolate clarity. "My father," Clara said, her voice echoing slightly in the hollow stone hut. "He really did it." It wasn't a question anymore. It was an autopsy of her past. Dominic opened his eyes. He looked down at her, watching her blood-stained hands work over his skin. He didn't offer empty comfort. He didn't tell her there might have been a mistake. In their world, hope was a liability. "He made a business decision," Dominic said quietly, his voice hoarse from the pain. "You were an acceptable loss for a $3 million write-off and the chance to take over the New England ports." Clara secured the heavy bandage with medical tape, wrapping it tightly around his waist. She sat back on her heels, wiping a streak of her own blood from her cheek where the wood splinter had cut her. She looked at her hands. They were coated in iodine, seawater, and the blood of 2 different men. She was a Gallagher. For 24 years, she had tried to pretend the blood money hadn't touched her. She had played the good daughter, the innocent bystander. That girl had died in the bedroom of the villa. "He thought I would just freeze," Clara said, staring at the dirt floor. "He thought I would cry and wait to be shot." She looked up, meeting Dominic's dead, slate-gray eyes. "I'm going to kill him, Dominic." There was no hysteria in her voice, no melodramatic tears. It was a stated fact, a promise carved in stone. Dominic studied her face for a long time. The pale skin, the torn pajamas, the fierce, unyielding fire burning in her eyes. The transaction was over. The marriage of convenience was dead. What sat in front of him was an entirely different creature, an ally forged in violence. The corner of his mouth twitched upward, a grim, respectful smirk. "Get in line, Clara," he whispered. "We have a lot of work to do." They stayed in the shepherd's hut for 3 days. It was an exercise in misery, dictated by the brutal calculus of survival. Dominic ran a fever by the second afternoon. His skin was clammy, radiating a dry, toxic heat. Clara didn't panic. Panic required energy they didn't have. She made short, calculated trips to the shoreline, filling empty water bottles from a small, freshwater runoff she found trickling through the rocks. She forced him to drink. She changed the dressing twice a day, using the last of the iodine, ignoring the ugly yellow and purple bruising that bloomed across his ribcage. On the 3rd night, the fever broke. Dominic woke up shivering, his slate-gray eyes clear and focused. He pushed himself upright, leaning heavily against the stone wall. He didn't thank her. Gratitude was a currency neither of them carried right now. "We need a phone," Dominic rasped, uncapping a water bottle with trembling hands. "A landline. No cells. There's a village about 5 miles north," Clara said. She had spent the days watching the coastline from the ridgeline, memorizing the geography. "I saw smoke from chimneys, fishing boats. They moved out at midnight. The hike took 4 hours. Dominic limped, his jaw set in a rigid line, his breath frosting in the freezing night air. Clara walked beside him, carrying the heavy duffel bag. Her silk pajamas were ruined, stiff with salt and dried mud. She wore Dominic's oversized, blood-stained suit jacket over her shoulders. She looked like a refugee from a war zone. She felt like one. The village was dead quiet, a cluster of whitewashed concrete buildings clinging to a steep cliff. They found a small, locked post office with a payphone bolted to the exterior wall. Dominic broke the lock on the coin box with the butt of his pistol, wired the connection, and dialed a 14-digit international sequence from memory. He spoke in rapid, hushed Sicilian. He gave coordinates, hung up, and ripped the receiver cord from the wall. 24 hours, he said, slumping against the brick wall. A boat is coming from Palermo. Who did you call? Clara asked. Leo. He's a cleaner. Been with my family since my father ran the Bronx. He's the only man alive I trust with a blind drop. They broke into a dry-docked fishing trawler to wait out the day, sleeping on coils of canvas rope that smelled of diesel and dead fish. When the sun dipped below the horizon, a sleek, matte black cigarette boat cut through the surf, running dark without running lights. Leo was a man in his 60s, built like a fire plug, with a face mapped by knife scars. He didn't ask questions. He hauled them aboard, handed them thick wool blankets, and hit the throttle. The safe house in Sicily was a windowless concrete bunker beneath an olive oil pressing facility. It was fully stocked with MREs, medical supplies, and an armory that rivaled a small precinct. For the first week, they existed in a vacuum. Dominic healed with the terrifying efficiency of a man who refused to be broken. Clara spent hours sitting at a metal table, dismantling and reassembling a Glock 19 until her fingers bled and calloused. Dominic had tossed it to her on their second day in the bunker. You want to kill a boss? Dominic had told her, watching her fumble with the slide. You don't do it with a champagne bottle. You learn the mechanics of murder. So she learned. She learned the weight of a full magazine. She learned the exact pressure required to break the sear. She learned that killing wasn't about anger. It was about geometry and timing. On the 8th day, Leo returned from Palermo with intel. He tossed a manila folder onto the metal table between them. It's everywhere, Leo said, his voice thick with gravel. The hit made the front pages in New York and Boston. Tragic ambush. Rival Albanian faction took out the newlywed couple on their honeymoon. Bodies burned in the villa fire. Dominic opened the folder. Inside were surveillance photos. Clara leaned over. The first photo showed a private dining room at a high-end Boston steakhouse. 2 men were shaking hands. One was Arthur, Dominic's towering underboss. The other was Frank Gallagher. Arthur is stepping up as acting boss of the Costello family, Leo explained, pointing at a thick-necked man in the background. He's telling the captains he's honoring your last wishes by forging a permanent peace with the Irish. Frank gets the New England ports. Arthur gets the New York supply lines. A joint venture, Dominic murmured. His tone was perfectly flat, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Arthur sold the security codes. Frank provided the bait. Clara stared at the photograph of her father. He was smiling. A broad, easy grin, holding a glass of scotch. She felt a phantom ache in her chest, the last decaying nerve of the daughter she used to be. She reached out and placed her finger over Frank's smiling face. When do we leave? She asked. Dominic closed the folder. Tonight. The Atlantic Ocean in December was a black, churning void. They crossed it inside a steel shipping container aboard a Panamanian freighter. It was the only way to bypass customs and Arthur's newly established border watch. Leo had retrofitted the container with a chemical toilet, battery-powered heating coils, and 2 cots. It smelled of ozone and damp rust. It was a sensory deprivation tank that forced them together in a space no larger than a walk-in closet. It was day 5 of the crossing. The heavy steel walls groaned and flexed against the violent winter swells. Clara sat on the floor, methodically loading hollow-point rounds into a magazine. Click, press, click, press. The rhythmic sound was the only thing keeping her grounded. She wore dark denim, a heavy black turtleneck, and combat boots. Her blonde hair, previously kept in a pristine society girl blowout, was roughly shorn to her jawline. She had cut it herself with a tactical knife in Sicily. Dominic sat on the edge of his cot across from her. He was field stripping an M4 carbine. He watched her hands. "You're flinching on the last round," Dominic observed quietly. "You're anticipating the tension of the spring. It's going to make you drop the mag when your hands are slick with blood." Clara paused. She looked at her thumb, raw from the brass casings. She forced her shoulders down, took a breath, and slotted the final round with a smooth, forceful push. "Better," he said. He set the upper receiver of the rifle down and leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. The dim LED strip overhead cast harsh shadows over his face. The pristine, untouchable Mafia boss from the wedding day was gone. He looked feral, dangerous. "You never asked why I didn't leave you in the cellar," Dominic said. It was the most personal sentence he had spoken since the wedding. Clara didn't look up from her weapon. "You needed a distraction. I gave you one." "I don't need distractions," Dominic countered. "I left you in that bathroom because my survival was the priority. But when I saw you standing over a trained killer with a bottle of Dom Perignon, you weren't a liability anymore. You were an asset." Clara finally looked at him. "Is that all this is, Dominic? Asset management?" "In our world, Clara, an asset is the highest compliment you can give someone. It means you hold value. It means you survive." He stood up. The space was so cramped, his knees nearly brushed hers. He crouched down, meeting her eyes level. The dead, winter morning stare was gone. In its place was a sharp, burning intensity. "Your father taught you that you were a pawn, something to be traded," Dominic said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate register. "I am telling you that you are a weapon, and a weapon belongs to no one but the person who pulls the trigger." Clara felt a sudden, sharp tightness in her throat. It wasn't sadness. It was the terrifying realization of absolute freedom. She had nothing left to lose. No family, no name, no future outside of the violence they were about to unleash. She reached out. She didn't think about it. She grabbed the collar of Dominic's dark shirt and pulled him forward. The kiss wasn't gentle. It was a collision. It was teeth and desperation, fueled by adrenaline, grief, and the claustrophobic darkness of the steel box. Dominic responded instantly, his hands gripping her waist, pulling her flush against his chest. His fingers dug into her sides, bruising her, grounding her. He tasted of stale black coffee and violent intent. There was no romance here. This was a blood pact sealed in the dark. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing heavy. Dominic didn't pull back far. He kept his forehead pressed against hers. "If you freeze when the shooting starts," Dominic whispered, his breath hot against her lips, "I will not save you a second time." "If you miss your targets," Clara whispered back, her hands sliding up to grip the nape of his neck. "I'll put a bullet in you myself." Dominic let out a low, dark chuckle. "Deal." The freighter docked in Boston Harbor at 3 a.m. A sleet storm was battering the coast, coating the metal gantry cranes in thick layers of ice. Leo was waiting for them at a designated drop point behind a wall of stacked pallets. He had a stolen black SUV idling in the shadows, the heater blasting. In the trunk were 2 tactical vests, encrypted radios, and the weapons they had shipped ahead. "They're at the Chelsea shipyard," Leo said, tapping a GPS coordinate into a burner phone. "Arthur is officially signing the maritime logistics over to Frank tonight. They have the main warehouse locked down, 12 men on the perimeter, maybe 10 inside." "Heavy?" Dominic asked, sliding a Kevlar vest over his shoulders. "Submachine guns and shotguns," Leo confirmed. "They're not expecting an assault, but they aren't taking chances." Dominic racked the slide of his M4. He looked at Clara. She was strapping a drop-leg holster to her thigh, her face pale but utterly composed in the harsh, flashing yellow light of a nearby harbor buoy. 12 outside, 10 inside, Dominic repeated, running the math. We drop the perimeter silently. Once we breach the doors, it's loud and fast. We don't stop moving until Arthur and Frank are on the floor. Clara slid 2 extra magazines into her tactical belt. She looked out at the freezing rain hitting the windshield. Her city, her father. "Let's go audit the books," she said. The Chelsea shipyard was a sprawling graveyard of rusted hulls and corrugated metal. Warehouse 4 sat at the end of a long, concrete pier extending into the black water of the Mystic River. It was a massive structure, illuminated by harsh halogen floodlights. The sleet was falling sideways, muting sound and cutting visibility to less than 50 feet. It was the perfect cover. Dominic and Clara approached from the waterside, slipping through the shadows of stacked shipping containers. The perimeter guards were miserable, huddled against the freezing wind, smoking cigarettes to stay warm. Dominic took the first 2. He moved like a shadow detaching from the darkness. A quick, brutal twist of a neck, a suppressed shot to the base of the skull. Silent, efficient. Clara took the third. A Gallagher soldier she recognized vaguely from her childhood. A guy named Sully who used to bring her bubble gum when she was 10. He was leaning against a forklift, blowing smoke into the freezing air. Clara stepped out from the container. She didn't hesitate. She raised the Glock, aligned the sights with the center of his chest, and pulled the trigger twice. Spit, spit. Sully dropped his cigarette, his eyes going wide with shock, before collapsing into a puddle of icy slush. Clara felt nothing, her heartbeat a steady, even rhythm. The girl who cried over scraped knees was a ghost. They cleared the perimeter in 7 minutes. 12 bodies hidden behind heavy machinery. They stood on either side of the heavy steel side door of the warehouse. Dominic held up 3 fingers. 2. 1. He kicked the door inward. The silence of the night shattered. Dominic stepped through the frame, his M4 roaring. He swept the lower floor, dropping 3 Costello men before they could unholster their weapons. The noise inside the cavernous metal building was deafening, a cacophony of echoing gunfire and shouting. Clara moved behind him, covering his blind spots. A man with a shotgun popped up from behind a stack of wooden crates. Clara snapped her sights onto him and fired 3 rounds. The man fell backward, his weapon discharging uselessly into the ceiling. They pushed forward, a 2-person execution squad operating in brutal, synchronized harmony. Dominic drew the heavy fire, moving from cover to cover with terrifying speed, while Clara picked off the flankers. The warehouse floor became a slaughterhouse of shattered glass, splintered wood, and blood slicking the concrete. At the far end of the warehouse sat a glass-walled foreman's office, elevated on a steel platform. Inside, Arthur and Frank were scrambling. Arthur was shouting into a radio, his face purple with panic. Frank was drawing a heavy revolver from his shoulder holster, kicking a heavy desk over to form a barricade. Dominic reloaded on the move, laying down suppressing fire on the steel staircase leading up to the office. "Covering!" Dominic roared over the din. Clara broke from her cover, sprinting across the open floor. Bullets pinged off the metal pillars around her, but she didn't flinch. She hit the steel stairs hard, taking them two at a time. She reached the landing, kicked the frosted glass door, and stepped into the office. Arthur turned, raising a pistol. Clara shot him directly in the kneecap. The towering underboss screamed, his leg buckling. He crashed to the floor, dropping his weapon. Frank Gallagher spun from behind the overturned desk, his revolver leveled at the doorway. He pulled the trigger. The hammer clicked on an empty chamber. He had emptied the gun blindly through the window. Frank stared. His hands dropped. The color drained from his face as he looked at the woman standing in the doorway. The cropped hair, the tactical gear, the steady, unblinking eyes over the barrel of a Glock 19. "Clara," he whispered. The name sounded like a prayer he had forgotten how to say. Dominic stepped into the office behind her, his rifle lowered, but ready. He looked at Arthur writhing on the floor, bleeding out over the blueprints of the port expansion. "Hello, Arthur," Dominic said coldly. "Your merger is denied." He didn't give the traitor time to beg. Dominic raised the M4 and put a single round through Arthur's head. The room fell sickeningly silent, save for the howling wind outside. Clara kept her gun leveled at Frank's chest. Frank swallowed hard, stepping out from behind the desk. He held his hands out, palms open. The tough, untouchable mob boss suddenly looked like an old, tired man. "Clara, sweetheart," Frank stammered, his eyes darting frantically between her and Dominic. "Listen to me. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Arthur told me you'd be spared. He told me he just wanted Costello. He promised me you wouldn't be in the room. You put me in the room, Frank," Clara said. Her voice was terrifying in its absolute lack of emotion. It was the voice of a ledger, balancing. "You walked me down the aisle. You tied me to a target, a $3 million debt. That's what I was worth." "I was protecting the family," Frank shouted, a desperate, pathetic attempt at authority. "If we didn't take the ports, the Italians would have starved us out. I made a hard call. You're a Gallagher. You know how this life works." "I do now," Clara said softly. She took a step forward. Frank flinched, backing into the glass wall overlooking the dark river. "You're my daughter," Frank pleaded, tears finally pooling in his eyes. "You're my blood. You can't do this." Clara tilted her head slightly. She looked at the man who had raised her. She remembered him teaching her how to ride a bike. She remembered him selling her to a hit squad. The two memories collided and dissolved into ash. "This isn't about blood, Frank," Clara said, her voice dropping to a harsh, cynical whisper. She echoed the words that had started it all. "This is just business." She pulled the trigger. The sound was shockingly loud in the enclosed office. Frank slammed backward against the glass, sliding down the pane, leaving a thick, dark streak behind him. He collapsed onto the floor, dead before his eyes stopped staring at the ceiling. Clara lowered the gun. Her hands weren't shaking. She felt a profound, heavy emptiness. The debt was paid. The ledger was closed. Dominic walked up beside her. He looked down at Frank's body, then over at Arthur. The two men who had orchestrated their demise were nothing more than meat on a linoleum floor. He didn't offer a platitude. He didn't ask if she was okay. He knew the cost of pulling that trigger, and he knew there was no going back from it. "The Costello captains will fall in line now," Dominic said quietly. looking out over the dark warehouse. And with Frank gone, the Irish syndicates will fracture. We take the ports by morning, total control. Clara ejected the magazine from her Glock, checking the remaining rounds, and slapped it back into the grip. She holstered the weapon and looked out through the shattered glass at the freezing Boston harbor. She was no longer a hostage. She was no longer a pawn. She was the architect of her own survival. Clara turned to her husband. The dead, slate-gray eyes looking back at her were no longer cold. They were assessing, respectful, bound to her by gunpowder and blood. "Call Leo," Clara said, her voice hard as diamond. "Tell him to bring the cleaning crew, and tell the capos I want a meeting at noon." Dominic's lips curved into a sharp, genuine smile. "Yes, boss." They walked out of the office together, descending into the dark, ready to build an empire on the ashes of the men who tried to bury them. That's how a pawn becomes a queen, and how a marriage of convenience turns into an empire of ash. If Clara and Dominic's ruthless path to the top kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button right now. Share this video with every dark romance and mafia drama lover, They need to see this betrayal unfold. Don't forget to hit subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss our next gritty storytelling deep dive. Who do you think was more ruthless, Clara or Dominic? Let me know in the comments below.